Hello class, my name is Rafael Portilla. I'm doing my presentation for INR4335 and my presentation is on motives for martyrdom, Al-Qaeda, Salafi Jihad, and the spread of suicide attacks. So let's get started with the author of the article. His name is Dr. Asaf Maghamad. He is a postdoctoral fellow at West Point. He teaches on the dynamics of interactions within and between militant groups, specializing in what we're going to talk about today, of martyrdom, jihad, and suicide attacks as a combat doctrine, and the ideological spread and foundations of suicide attacks, and how they become an increasingly global phenomenon in ways that we understand and at the same time don't understand. So let's get started with what he has to say about martyrdom. As you know, he's very qualified to speak about this particular subject due to his extensive connections in Israel, and also in West Point, the Pentagon, the University of Maryland, and all sorts of terrorism and counterterrorism institutions. He's talking about how martyrdom and suicide attacks have become an increasingly global phenomenon, and he attributes this to a couple of things. But let's start off with the preliminary basis. So he cites Abdullah Azzam as being credited with tuning martyrdom into a combat doctrine. And it's not just that martyrdom encompasses suicide attacks, but it also encompasses death at jihad. It means anyhow that you were to perish in a jihad, it would be for martyrdom purposes. And it's interesting that suicide attacks are one of the first things we consider in terms of martyrdom and suicide attacks. But it's interesting because Islam forbids the taking of one's own life, and of course, you know, with a suicide attack, most times you achieve your goal by killing yourself. It's interesting because it is a sin, and Abdullah Azzam basically gets around this and you know, I would say kind of justifies killing yourself in a suicide attack as different from killing yourself for a failure of profession, education, or a personal reason. This is because he says that martyrdom and suicide attacks are basically fulfilling the will of their God and also advancing the cause for Muslims around the world. Now, around the world is interesting because typically we associate terrorist attacks of, you know, suicide attacks, martyrdom, and all sorts of other attacks, you know, on Western nations. And that certainly is the case. There's Western interests all across the world, the 9/11 attacks and all sorts of other attacks on, you know, U.S. soil that have, you know, been traced to these doctrines. But it's also occurred in North Africa, the Middle East, and other places that don't typically come to mind when you think of a terrorist suicide attack or a martyrdom style combat doctrine. But Asaf attributes this uptick that we're seeing into a global phenomenon to Salafi jihadists, and they fall under mostly Sunnis. And these Salafi jihadists have globalized this doctrine, and we're going to get into that in a second. But before we get into what it means to differentiate between a localized terrorist attack and a globalized attack, we're going to discuss why ideology plays an important role, and not just ideology, but basically an entire environment and set of conditions that makes these suicide and martyrdom attacks not just palatable, but also agreeable in some Muslim communities. So, Asaf mentions ideology is of course important to the spread of attacks that include martyrdom and self-sacrifice, but he says they're not the prerequisite as such. Ideology plays a role in kind of dulling the blow of, committing a martyrdom suicide attack, and also dulling the blow of possibly hurting other people that are maybe sympathetic to the cause. And it's interesting because, as Asaf says, this ideology helps in reducing the suicide attackers' reservations to perpetrate the acts of killing and dying. And of course, killing and dying are very serious aspects of this doctrine, because you technically blow yourself up, kill yourself, whatever type of attack you do that causes your death and the death of others is never going to be an easy thing to pull off, and it quite likely contributes to the success of this doctrine in the goals as outlined by Salafi jihadis such as Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and other terrorist organizations. Now, what's interesting is when we think of suicide attacks, we think of senseless, wanton destruction, but it's quite the contrary. There is a calculated, goal-oriented doctrine, suicide attacks, and it's perpetrated by people that know what they're doing. It's not a mental illness or some other, maybe aberration or psychological condition. It's deliberate and rational, not in any sense associated with mental illness, according to most of the analytics and analysts that Dr. Asaf mentions. And it's also interesting to note the role of popularizing suicide attacks. Asaf mentions that including movies, comics, plays, books, anything of the sort that glorifies these type of attacks and combat doctrines, all these things play a role in the frequency and willingness of a community to engage in these types of attacks. It's interesting to note that he says that researchers claim that sustained levels of suicide terrorism depend entirely on strong support of a community. So in a community that supports these types of actions, you'll get significantly more issues and attacks based off martyrdom and suicide doctrines. So what I want to talk about now is localized suicide missions. These are quite different from the globalized uptick that Dr. Asaf is really concerned with, but it's important to mention this. So Dr. Asaf says that groups that conduct localized suicide missions mostly target people and assets of the enemy state near or in the conflict area, while largely refraining from targeting assets of their foes in other locations. So this is a typical, I would say, insurgency against a perhaps occupying power. You attack with these hit and run tactics, these strong, demoralizing, and quite frankly damaging attacks for quite a low risk and a possibly high yield, with the goals of increased regional autonomy, self-determination, and the expulsion of an occupying power. And these are localized things, localized attacks that you see across North Africa, the Middle East, and as Dr. Asaf has mentioned, they are perpetrated mostly by Sunnis, with the Salafi jihadists. And within this context, they usually target Shiites, which are considered by the Salafis to be heretical and, Western puppets usually. And it's interesting to note that not much is talked about in terms of suicide attacks within these communities, because they're labeled as apostates by the Sunnis, and the apostates basically equates to infidels and people who sold themselves to Western ideals, and as such become valid targets to the Salafi jihadists. So examples of these groups include Hamas, the PIJ, which is the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah. So these secular or nationalist groups also include the Kurdistan Workers' Party and Fatah's al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. So these suicide missions wreak considerable havoc on their targets. They as Dr. Asaf also says, these targets were relatively few in number, but the vast majority of these attacks take place in a handful of countries in North America and the Middle East. So he mentions usually Israel, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, and Turkey as typical locations for these attacks to take place on a localized scale. Now, of course, Dr. Asaf mentions the trends of globalizing terrorist and suicide attacks, and he says that Salafi jihadist groups have overwhelmingly planned and executed the new globalized suicide missions. Overwhelmingly is important because, as you'll see in combating these doctrines, there's a significant difference in determining what types of groups plan these attacks and how these groups can figure into defeating these tactics in the long run. But Dr. Asaf compiled a staggering amount of data debating how these attacks have risen in frequency since 1999, especially through 2008. He also talks about how the casualty figures have also increased. So, to add some perspective, between 1995 and 96, Al-Qaeda decided not to attack the near enemy, which the near enemy we've discussed as being Shiites, apostates, and whatever they consider infidels. But they decided to attack the far enemy, the Western infidel countries, which is above all their public enemy number one, the United States. As we have seen with 9/11, perhaps the most devastating terrorist attack this nation has ever endured. But that is a trend that this globalizing trend is a trend that led to those horrific events. Now, Dr. Asaf mentions, and this is what's really interesting, that the vision of this globalized Martyrdom brigade is to create an international rapid reaction force that would come to the rescue of Muslims wherever and whenever they were in need. We'll get to the inconsistencies that it breeds in a few minutes. But this Muslim Legion will be self-perpetuating, which ties again to the popularizing of these martyrdom and jihadist doctrines, generating new waves of Islamic warriors who would fight and defeat infidel and apostate countries the world over. This battle cry and new globalized doctrine would exponentially increase the exposure of these martyrdom and suicide attacks, as well as damage any sort of fail-safes that were within Muslim communities because of the popularizing of these attacks. Now, many of today's suicide attacks are regarded much of the world as a legitimate target. That is a very powerful tool for the martyrdom and jihadists to have. Much of the world as a legitimate target makes planning and countering these plans exceedingly difficult. They become almost uncounterable because you don't know what the battlefield is. It's not clearly defined. There's new ways for infrastructure to be attacked, for lives to be lost with new and previously unthought of ways of attacking a nation. So it's interesting to note that this is a truly global conflict with no defined battle lines, and of course their goal is to destabilize U.S. interests and punish pro-Western parties such as apostates, Shiites, via all sorts of Western interests as essentially provokers for suicide attacks. Now, we're going to keep discussing a few things about the effectiveness of martyrdom. So, Dr. Asaf has dedicated considerable effort to compiling concrete data, and he states that studies dedicated to explaining the causes of suicide attacks, which were rare until the attacks of September 11th, have increased. And it's interesting to note that cases explaining the causes of suicide attacks and popular literature on this doctrine didn't exist until 9/11, and that's because it's unlike traditional suicide attacks. These attacks occur frequently over large areas, and Dr. Asaf mentions something very powerful, and it says here that the targets of many globalized suicide bombers are seldom aware that they are involved in a conflict with a bitter enemy who seeks their death along with its own. Who can even combat that? In a global battlefield where almost any target associated with a nation is a legitimate target, and you have no idea as a nation when this is coming, or even if you're engaged with that until it happens, it's a very effective combat doctrine to utilize, especially when there's lack of a traditional military per se. These attacks claimed 20,603 lives and left at least 50,000 people wounded between 1999 and 2008. And Dr. Asaf contributes most of these attacks to the Salafi jihadists. So, this video is running quite long, so I do want to start drawing to a conclusion regarding combating these doctrines. Dr. Asaf basically advances that this is a primarily Muslim debate, and the solution to these doctrines and understanding how to defeat them must be a predominantly Muslim endeavor. As such, he states we must encourage debate within Muslim communities to ostracize and honestly isolate these units of Salafi jihadists, because not only are they injurious to the national security of the United States and our Western allies, and in fact almost any ally,